Episode of Business and Innovation Q&A for young entrepreneurs and others. So I see there were all kinds of questions left over from last time, oh gosh, where to start here? Well, there's a question here. So many questions. Wow. Well, thanks for all these questions. Let's start with one from William here. What company would you start today if you grew up during these times? You know, I think the thing to understand is the best company to start is the one that you're really interested in what it's going to make and what it does. I mean, I think that I started the companies I've started because I wanted the things that those companies were going to make. You know, I use Wolfram language every day to do the things I want to do. I use the things we built in the Wolfram Alpha knowledge base every day to do the things I want to do. These are the companies that I have chosen to start and lead are the companies that do things that I really want. Now, in terms of, there are other things that I've been interested in that are sort of things that I need, whether it's for personal analytics, whether it's for archiving, whether it's other kinds of things that I say, I want these things, and I don't have to start a whole company to do them, but I could imagine doing that. I think, you know, I see people, there are different ways to think about starting companies. Some people say, I want to start a company, and then they say, well, what should the company do? And that has not been my mode of doing things. I'm more, this is what I want to do. A company is a good way to do that. Now, an example of something I've been interested in doing is our project to find the fundamental theory of physics. That's not really a company because it's not, you know, unless we, you know, get to create warp drive and sort of keep the rights to it for the next few hundred years until it's practical, so to speak. It's not, that's not really a commercial operation. And it's something which needs a different kind of an entity to move it forward, not something which is a company in the traditional sense. So I think this is a very, you know, if you give me some particular areas, I might say this is a kind of thing I might think about doing. But in a sense, what company one should do is very much tied up, I think, with what one wants to do oneself. I think, you know, sometimes people can take a sort of hobby type thing that they have and say, this is something they really know about, they really care about, this is what they want to make a company out of. I mean, I also have certainly seen people who say, oh, here's this nifty market opportunity. I don't really know anything about it. I don't really care about it directly, but I just want to start a company and I'm going to do it around that market niche. I have seen that be successful. It is not my personal way of doing things or what to me would seem the most exciting. I mean, the thing that, you know, I've seen a whole variety of people who say, I once made this mistake myself, actually, who say, this is a thing that one could do, and it's something that would be kind of a worthwhile thing in the world, and it's probably a good commercial opportunity, but I'm not really that excited about it. This was, I did this once, when was this? This must have been around 1984-ish, 5-ish. I built my first company developing mathematical computation software kinds of things. And one of the things I knew was going to be necessary and useful was to have an interpreted version of something like the C programming language, a kind of a C interpreter as sort of a development environment, a way to, it's kind of a modern, well, it's actually, I'm not sure if anybody's ever even done this, even to this day, of having an interpreted version of C that can be run in an IDE. Perhaps they've done it. I think there was a person who was actually an intern on the project that I did who subsequently built a big company that was based on sort of IDEs and perhaps took those ideas and turned them into something interesting. But what I was, the concept there was, this is something I sort of think, oh, I know I can do this. Oh, you know, there's a market for it because people are developing lots of, you know, C code and so on. Let me go ahead and put together a team and try and do this. And I just wasn't that into it. And I could kind of tell that it was it was sort of doomed as soon as I realized it was kind of I was like saying, well, I should work on this for a bit, but I really want to work on this other thing over here that's something about science. And I kind of realized that this wasn't really going to go anywhere because I wasn't that deeply invested in the result. So anyway, that's my point of view about those kinds of things. Now, let's see. There's a question here from Udesio. How much do you think high scores in school and college influence your employees or new employees? Is it nice to have, I think the question is kind of about smart co-workers and so on. I have to say, this whole question about, how do you find great employees? First point to make is a great employee for me won't necessarily be a great employee for somebody else, and vice versa. There are people who are a great fit to work in a big company that has all kinds of mechanisms in it, and they're a terrible fit for a company of my size. There are people who are a great fit for a tiny company with 10 people in it. Again, not a great fit for my company. There are people who, for whom a company that is very oriented towards sales, they'll be a great fit for that. There are people who are a great fit for a company that's very oriented towards R&D. It's not the case that there's a person who you say, this is a grade A person and they'll fit into any company. It's kind of a two-way issue. There's a company, it has a certain culture, it has certain character, it has certain size and so on. And there's a person, and there's certain kinds of companies that person is likely to fit into. And I think that and some different topics and missions of companies that will resonate with that person or not, and so on. And I think that's, it's important both with people who are looking for jobs in companies and for companies who are looking for people to hire. And sometimes also there'll be a person who will join a company at a certain stage. They'll be fantastic when the company is tiny. And when the company gets bigger and more organized, they're really not appropriate, and vice versa. I mean, when our company was young, there were people who were very helpful to us in going from, in doing things in a kind of scrappy way that was appropriate for, let's say, a 20-person company. But by the time you have a 200-person company, you have to have much more systematic things running. And it's no good to just sort of leave things to the last minute and then scramble around and do them. Whereas that's exactly the right thing to do if you have a 20-person company. If you build the giant system for doing all of your HR processes and so on, whatever it is, and you've only got 20 people, you're wasting a huge amount of time because you just don't need that stuff. It's not going to come up very often. It's like, okay, if it happens to come up, let's scramble and make that work. But if you have a bigger company, it's something where you really need a system because it's going to come up, and you need kind of a systematic way to organize things. I mean, it's also the case that the sort of functions that can get done in kind of the in a routine way in a company and don't have to rise to the level of kind of management or other people who can think about things for the first time. I mean, I think there's an important distinction between a case where you're in normal operating conditions, where you're just doing something, we have a procedure for this, we're just going to follow the procedure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, versus this is something new and different, we've never seen it before, let's figure out what to do. Different kinds of people are good at those two different things. Some people are really good at, nothing is known, let's figure it out from scratch. And, they really are not prepared to sort of do this, let's just be very systematic. And other people, they can really run the systematic machine, but if something goes kind of off the rails, it's like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. So different kinds of people for different roles and stages in a company. Now, I think that, you ask, what does one look for in, you've got a potential employee and you say, is this somebody I want to hire? Is this not somebody I want to hire? What are some things to look for? In our company, so there are many different signals you can get, okay? Somebody has gone to a super fancy school and they've got super fancy grades. It's a signal. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's actually kind of, for us, a negative signal. Somebody will come from, they didn't make it through, this level of school. Well, again, it's a signal. There may be reasons, there may be, for example, one thing that used to be said, I haven't heard this for a while at our company, but about hiring people with PhDs, particularly with PhDs in fields that like, things have changed over the years, so it's perhaps not. But sometimes it's just like a lot of PhDs, a lot of fields get very, very, very specific. The chance that we're going to need the actual expertise that somebody got by doing a PhD in this particular, very, very verticalized area, there are a few cases where we need that, but mostly it's very unlikely that the particular thing they did their PhD in is going to be the particular thing we need. And so, one statement made in the past is the main thing we learn from the fact that somebody did a PhD is that they're capable of finishing a big project like that. And that's a signal. That's an interesting signal. Sometimes, the thing I've noticed is people who have sort of the breadth of knowledge that people have is sometimes less if they've gone on and got that PhD and been very kind of narrowly directed than if they didn't go so far in the kind of educational system, but they're sort of learning about everything. In fact, sometimes there are people who are kind of, they're interested in everything. Somebody says, well, you should do a PhD. They say, what in? I've got, 15 different things that I'm interested in. I don't really want to spend 5 years, concentrating on one specific thing. Depending on what kind of role you're interested in having somebody work in, it can be really useful to have those people who are interested in, a wide diversity of things and weren't narrowed by the process of sort of getting a PhD. Now, not everybody who gets a PhD in some very specific thing is narrowed down to that specific thing, but that's a potential risk there. I would say that the kind of the whole sort of test scores, how well do people do on things? It's another signal, but honestly, it's often a confusing signal. I mean, I have to say that sometimes these people who will, occasionally somebody will quote their IQ on a resume, and that's usually for our company. Again, I'm not going to say that anything that I say is completely general. That's usually a super bad sign. It's like, yeah, I can do an IQ test, but if I'm put in something other than the particular kind of maze that an IQ test is, I'll just be completely lost. That's often the signal that comes from that. I would say that the thing that has, I used to years ago. I haven't done this for years, so I'm not giving away anything really here, but I used to do interviews of more junior people. I don't tend to do very many of those myself at this point. But somebody will say on their resume, I got a GPA of 3.8 out of 4, and grades in college or whatever. And whatever the number was, so long as it wasn't an actually perfect grade, you always say, why didn't you do better? And people think, and they think about it a bit, and they give you an answer. And they say either things like, well, I'm just not smart enough, or, oh, I was distracted, or, oh, the courses I took were too hard, or whatever else. And, I used to notice that some people would just say, well, whatever. But it was a very common thing that the excuse, in a sense, for why didn't you do better was what you would hear again if you ended up hiring that person and they were working in some role and they couldn't get something done or couldn't figure out how to do something. It would be the same kind of this is why I couldn't get there. I'm not sure that's and I'm not sure there's any right answer to that question, but it was sort of interesting. You can kind of in talking to people and interviewing people, kind of one of the goals is to understand what it is you have. There's a person, you're talking to them, they will have certain characteristics. You might understand what the role that you want at your company is. The question is this person, can you figure out in a certain amount of time enough about this person to see whether they're going to fit this role at your company or fit in? For us, we're quite often doing interviews of people where we think this is an interesting person. We're not quite sure what role they're going to fit into. Let's see whether we can figure that out. And it's sort of a question of what can you figure out? And I would say that for me, I may be an untypical in this regard, but for me, my sort of goal in interviewing people is just be able to answer the question. If somebody asked me a question about this person and about how this person would react and perform in a certain role, that after the time I've spent interviewing them, that I would be able to answer that question, that I would know enough about this person to be able to answer that question. And usually it's like you talk to somebody about whatever they know about, You just kind of get to know them. Asking, oh, I've got this specific question, can you solve this problem on a blackboard or something? I've never done that. I know some groups at our company do try and do things like that. For me, that's not a successful way to learn about people, because it's sort of testing a very, very tiny corner of what's going on, and not really, and everybody is different. And the trick is, as sort of an interviewer, to try and kind of learn enough about the person, as I say, to be able to answer the question. It's another thing that I've noticed is this is a thing for getting references on people, which we don't tend to do all that much, because I have to say, unless you're doing sort of a repeat transaction, unless it's like, oh, there's this school, we're getting all these graduates from that school, and we can kind of, it's useful to know for the N plus first graduate, how do they compare to the first N graduates? Then that's a thing where it's worth asking, well, how do these people compare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I have to say that usually you're kind of dealing with, oh, let's get a reference from this person we don't know anything about. And in fact, I know when I was a long time ago, when the company was first running, there was a particular well-known professor, a very fine fellow. I like him very much, but he sent us some students, and he sent these letters about them, and I'm reading these letters, and it's like, oh, there's a very impressive letter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's hire this person. So I did that 2 or 3 times, and the people just not very good for us. And then I realized, look, it's just writing a nice letter about everybody. He's a nice guy. You don't really learn anything from this. So the one thing I have found that is useful in if you do end up like checking references with people is, you're talking to the person who's the reference, and you basically say, you describe the job that you have potentially for the person you're getting a reference on, and you ask the reference, if this person were going to fail at this job, what is the most likely way do you think that they would fail? And some people would just say they won't fail, whatever. You learn nothing from that. But very often people will kind of pause and they'll think for a minute, and then they'll say something, and that thing will be useful and interesting, and it'll give you kind of a thing to be thinking about, which won't necessarily in any way say, oh no, we shouldn't hire this person, but it's a useful way to get some sort of insight into that person and their characteristics. But I have to say that I'm when if you look at sort of people who get the best grades, it's like, I've been around long enough, I know what happened to all the kids I knew in school who got the top grades, so to speak. And I would say that it's a mixed bag in terms of whether you'd say they have worldly success, they led a fulfilled life, they would be good people to be working with. It's a very mixed bag, and it's certainly not the case. Better score in school, better employee, better person. It's just not true. It is selecting for a very particular set of attributes, and they're people who win all the prizes. I sort of pride myself on being a person who does things for which there aren't prizes. So I win no prizes, so to speak. Or sometimes I'm impressed because a prize will find me, so to speak, and it's like, wow, that's pretty innovative of it. In other words, there's a certain. I'm often surprised. There are people they've got this giant list. I've won all these prizes. And it's like, that's a certain type of person who manages to craft what they're doing, or chooses to craft what they're doing as a sort of prize winning activity. And it tells you something. It's another signal in kind of the picture. I think that, it's also the case that sometimes I think, when it comes to you go to the right college in the US or something, whatever that means. It's the US, for those who aren't US centric, I mean, the way college works is very different in different countries around the world. There are plenty of countries around the world where it's just like, well, you go to the college that's in the town where you live, and that's pretty much what you do. And sort of all of the colleges in the big towns are sort of more or less equivalent. In the US, there's sort of a certain kind of, among the large state universities, that's kind of almost the way that it works. But there are also the fancy elite colleges that have a different kind of sort of clientele. And I think what one realizes there is a certain, it's never clear what the fundamental foundations for, what does college admissions look for at a college. If you're hiring people at a company, what you're fundamentally looking for is employees who are going to make your company productive. If you're looking for students coming into a college, what are you fundamentally looking for? If you're a cynic, you might say you're looking for people who will somehow contribute to the endowment X years from now. If you're very professor oriented, you might say, I want students who the professors will enjoy teaching. I'm afraid very few colleges work that way anymore, at least in the US. Usually the admissions process is quite separate from sort of what the professors are doing or wanting. But so in the end, what often comes down to is that the sort of default thing is, let's get more of the same. We've got a certain culture of students, we've got a certain culture of operations at this college. Let's get more students who are like that. So you end up with these sort of quite definite personalities of people going to different colleges. And yes, there are certain kinds of roles where that is another signal that's quite useful. Is, well, I think it's mostly nature, not nurture, of students going to a college. It's mostly they're not molded by the experience at the college. It's more that they are selected coming in to be sort of some particular personality type, very success oriented, very sort of perfectionistic, very different kinds of things. So that's a signal. And I'm not sure that for our particular company, and sometimes I would say that some of that ends up being, there's some places where if one's a little bit cynical, one's going to say they're people who are good at selling themselves, which is an attribute that in some businesses is super useful. Doesn't happen to be that useful for most roles at our company. But it is useful to other people in other companies. And there are companies where sort of the big point of the company is to kind of sell the intelligence of the company. It's providing services and things. And it's like, everybody's very smart here. We want to communicate that to you. So if you have somebody who's been sort of selected to be good at selling themselves, that's a very good attribute for a company like that, whether it's in investment banking or consulting or whatever else, or even some tech companies and so on. So anyway, I think the thing that, again, the thing is, there are certain signals you get from certain attributes of employees, and there's certain things you have to understand about who's likely to be successful in a particular role you're hiring for. I mean, one of the things I've noticed, the first time we hire for a particular kind of role, it's very hard to know who's going to be successful. And we'll get it wrong some fraction of the time. By the time we've hired 10 people for a role like that, we can understand what the role really involves, what kind of a person is really going to work in such a role, and we can be much more reliable at hiring people for that role. I think that, that's, let's see, I was going to say another thing about hiring. One thing is the resume. And sometimes, I mean, resumes run the gamut from being very cut and dried to being incredibly long and sort of giant essays and so on, and incredibly sort of, incredibly kind of self-promotional to being very kind of matter of fact and so on and so on and so on. There's also cover letters, and cover letters tend to be, they're interesting. I mean, I think that, again, varies with the company. At least for us, I think the letter that starts, I have a degree in X, therefore I am qualified for the job you have posted about whatever, X prime, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. For us, that's not a great sign. It's more, I would say that the sometimes we'll get very, very sort of interesting cover letters. I remember one from a person who was the cover letter said, "I've used your product for many years. I found many bugs. I've reported them. Now I think I should come and work for your company and fix some of them." It's kind of fun. I would say that person ended up working at the company for many years, not in R&D, but in technical marketing, for which he was very good. it's you know, there are things that are kind of very lively and exciting like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. I would say that any time for people who are kind of looking to work at companies, you know, for goodness sake, when you you know, when you write to the company, know something about the company. I remember years ago, somebody I knew at who was some kind of dean at a well-known elite university, and she wanted me to give a talk to some of their humanities graduates about you know, the corporate sector and kind of I think it was part of some kind of panel type thing, and the main thing I said was, you know, these were people who were getting PhDs in humanities, and the main thing I said was, the main thing you have to know about, you know, getting jobs at companies is go research the companies. You know, you have some idea about what you want to do, go research. You know, does the company have, you know, if you're an archaeologist, does the company actually go and dig up pieces of cities and need archaeologists or something? And if so, how do they use them, and whatever it is? You know something about the company, do research. And for these folk, it was actually kind of a very bizarre and innovative idea that they would apply their research skills that they've been using for a history PhD or something like this, and actually use them to research companies, to go find out, just like they were finding out, oh, about this, you know, person in the 1600s or something who did this. Go find out this company, you know, go do the research, go read the documents and see what you can find from that. And you know, being able to write a letter that explains why you can be useful to a company, and particularly if you're not applying for a specific, you know, posted job somewhere, you know, why you can be useful, and make the case. You have to know something about the company. The thing not to do, at least again, from my observation, is don't say more than you know, or don't say more than you're sure about. I mean, if somebody writes to me and says, you know, I'd like to come to your company so I can help you to be more effective in, you know, in the K through 8 math market. Okay, fine. We're not really in that market particularly, so it's you know, that's a miss, so to speak. I mean, unless the person's saying, you know, I could build something for you in that case. It's like, you know, actually don't jump to conclusions about the company and kind of say more than you know, because you'll just look silly, because the people who are reading the letter are probably going to actually know something about the company if they've been working there for a long time. I think, I mean, I will say that in terms of people who are starting companies, and that's a whole different issue of starting companies, finding co-founders and so on. That's a very complicated business. I mean, I think that it's the most important thing to realize about that is that you know, you start a company, you have an idea for what it's going to do. In 5 years, or even in a couple of years, there will no doubt be divergence, both in what the company does and what the different people, you know, the different people come in and say, oh yeah, we're all excited about starting this company. Well, in a couple of years, one of the people may be off, and they may, you know, have a mortgage, and they may be, you know, running a family and, you know, doing all this kind of thing. And it's like they don't want to take as high risks as they did a couple of years earlier, or they may be, you know, all kinds of different things will happen, or people just decide they don't like each other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's divergence that happens as a result of just sort of things happening in people's lives. And typically what happens is, if a company is expanding rapidly enough, there's a niche for everybody. Even if people have diverged and somebody is going to be the high octane manager and somebody else is just going to be the techie sitting in the corner writing code, you know, there's sort of room for everybody if the company is in rapid expansion. If the company has many kind of constraints and has to decide, is it this or is it that, that can lead to all kinds of trouble. And that's sort of an issue when you start things, of making sure that you actually know how it will, you know, if people end up saying, well, I really don't want to, you know, go on doing this way. If you can, and it's often not easy to do, to make sort of a kind of a strategy where the thing can sort of separate in a way that is sort of appropriate to everybody, and where you don't end up with kind of trailing, you know, things dragging down the company by people saying, oh, you know, running around with pitchforks or whatever, complaining about this or that, or otherwise draining things. It's much better to be able to have things kind of smoothly. Well, you know, let's go our separate ways, but it's going to be okay, so to speak. All right, let's see. Many more questions here. Let's see. Okay, there's a question from Parmenides. When do you decide to release a product, assuming that you never feel like something is ever completely done or perfect? We haven't had that issue so much. I mean, it's a question of so, you know, look, one of the features of CEOing things is you're always making decisions. You know, today I've probably made, I don't know, I've done a whole bunch of things today. And, you know, there's a lot of things where it's like, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, decide, you know, make a decision. There's multiple possibilities. It's like, you know, let's just decide to do something. And sometimes it's like, do we, you know, it's like I was looking at some stuff to do with Wolfram this morning. It's like, well, we could go and we could, and some things I was thought about it and it's like, well, this isn't quite right. We got to change this. And other things, it's like, look, it's close enough. We'll just go with it. And yes, that's a thing one gradually learns is how to make the decision of what matters and what doesn't. And, you know, sometimes one will get it wrong. Sometimes one will say that doesn't matter. And it turns out it does matter a lot. Sometimes when it's a thing where, you know, let's say you're doing some mailing to people and it's going to go to 1 million people. Well, then it matters a lot what the details are. And you probably want to test some things before you send it all out. If it's only going to go to 100 people, then, well, you know, if there's something slightly wrong and there's a comma missing here and something is a little bit obscure, it doesn't really matter so much. You know, people will send you back mail saying, I don't understand what you're talking about, and it'll be sort of okay. But you know, this question of what matters and what doesn't, it's a tricky question. And as I say, I think, you know, it's part of the world of CEOing, for example, is figuring out, you know, figuring that out. Now, in terms of sort of getting something to perfection, I mean, my way of doing things tends to be that it's sort of you define what it is you think you want, and then you get it as good as you can within those constraints. And occasionally there'll be a thing, usually, okay, so my basic approach tends to be, there's a certain set of fairly soft targets. There's a certain set of things there's low-hanging fruit. You can get all this low-hanging stuff. And then maybe there's something that's higher hanging. You know, first question is it really higher hanging, or is it the case, you know, did somebody just not figure out how to bring it down to, you know, to a lower level so it's easier to do? But assume it is kind of higher hanging and you're convinced about that. Well, then you have to say, okay, let's define this product to not need this thing that we can't really get to immediately. I think another thing that's very important in defining products particularly is to sort of bite off a thing that you can actually chew, bite off at the, you know, present something you can actually deliver. We made a few mistakes in those, in that regard. I mean, for example, one, when we built our cloud, which we started, when was it, a dozen years ago now. The original thing that was imagined was take any notebook from our desktop application and put it in the cloud and it'll work the same. That was too much to sign up for. It took us a decade to get to the point where that was a reasonable thing to deliver. We should have signed up for something much more modest, which we could actually deliver, and then deliver that and make sure that the thing we deliver is still something compelling and easy, you know, and can be described in a way where people can understand why they care about it, but wasn't we signed up for this huge thing and we just can't deliver it. Because the worst thing is to say we've got this great thing, and you know, you get people excited about it, then they try it and it just doesn't work, and they go away unhappy. So I think the you know, my tendency tends to be, you define a set of things, you try and figure out what's easy, what's hard, you try and sort of define what is the thing that can be enclosed by the parts that are easy, describe and deliver that. You know, the hard parts you work on next, and then sometimes it's very complicated. Like when we were building Wolfram Alpha, nobody had built anything like that before. And it got better and better. And, you know, it was more and more random queries that people would type in could be done, but we had no idea what would happen when we actually deployed it to the world. And we had done a bunch of tests. They weren't very useful. They weren't large enough volume to be helpful. really we had to, it was kind of a thing where we could see that just by small scale testing, we couldn't make much more progress. So it was something where we kind of had to kind of bite the bullet and release the thing to the world, because that was the only way we could kind of make further progress. And turns out it worked just fine. That was a case where we had to make that decision. But it's the same thing. I mean, I think it's the same thing when I work on things in science. I tend to try and do the same thing. It's not always a great thing in science, because it's like one has a certain topic and let's do all the easy stuff in that topic. I think sometimes it's better in science to say, let's leave, maybe also sometimes in some software things, to leave some pieces over for other people to work on, so that they can kind of get in there without it being the case that the first thing for somebody else to add is a thing for which you have to climb a kind of tall ladder to get there. I think that in the case of software development, sometimes if you're building a platform where you could say, well, let's make it easy for people to add things to this. I don't know. I think I've never done that. It tends to be the case that the more common hack is, oh, we make the product only just, we don't need to make the product that good. We'll fill it all in with services. Even though we're delivering kind of a crummy product, we'll charge people for the consulting service of actually making it work for them, and it'll all sort of be sort of filled in by that sort of services thing. I know people who think that I'm kind of a total idiot for the fact that we put so much effort into making our products really be kind of end user deliverable and usable, and not just say, well, we got this great thing, and to actually use it, we're going to sell you a whole bunch of services to help you be able to use it. I mean, there are plenty of companies in the enterprise software business, for example, where that's really how it works. The base product is not terribly usable. You really have to buy a bunch of services to get it to the point where it's usable. And that's a definite model for doing business. Doesn't happen to be the model I've adopted, but again, different things for different people. Let's see. There's a question here from Oflamio. How would someone who picked an education that didn't provide worthwhile skills and connections catch up? Well, I think one thing is, in terms of the skills, is like, pick the thing you're going to go after. There are plenty of things like the whole computational language stack that we've built, where it's not completely clear that there's an existing sort of, there are certainly places that do it, but in general, it's not something where getting to be very proficient in that is something where there's a step one, a 101 class, a 102 class, et cetera, that gets you to that point. It's something where, and we see that constantly with people who are learning kind of the new technology that we've built, that people can come, they kind of resonate with that technology and with that way of thinking about things. They have the kind of sort of computational way of thinking about things. They can kind of learn it and kind of jump to the point where they can be highly, highly useful, even though, they got a degree in history or something, and that didn't, they didn't teach them, and they haven't done any programming at all. In fact, sometimes with our sort of computational language world, people who learn Wolfram language as their first language, they do great with it. If they learnt a bunch of low-level languages, before, they'll be writing weird for loops and things, and they won't really get the idea of computational language and how to sort of use it to really, jump to the top of the stack, so to speak. So there are things like that where we're learning something new. I mean, I know when blockchain was kind of a new thing, there are plenty of people kind of going into blockchain who had really random weird backgrounds, but this was a new thing. So if you're prepared to learn something new, you can kind of jump to the front without having gone and studied in school. There weren't blockchain courses that you could study to get to the point where you're a blockchain person. Different track. So that's one thing, is to sort of figure out the things that are kind of new, for which the fact that you didn't happen to spend all those years sort of being educated in a particular direction is, I see that even at the level of sort of software engineering kinds of things, that there's sort of new things where people can learn them. Oh, I don't know, people who do DevOps, for example, often their resumes, I mean, it's kind of, they're these funny areas where where the resumes in terms of educational achievement will go from the, didn't really finish high school to the, became a professor. And, these people are all doing, let's say, DevOps, and, you can't really tell which one is going to do better. It's not something that's based on sort of the existing educational attainment scale, because it's just a new kind of thing. And it's a certain set of skills that aren't really skills that are delivered particularly by education. Now, in terms of connections, that's, and again, it depends a bit on the industry. There are some industries that are heavily, connections based, where there's sort of a trust network of people. Oh, this person went to this school and this person knows this person, and so they must be okay. And there are other ones where it's like, look, if you can do a good job, then that's great. And it doesn't really matter what your sort of connectivity or not is. I would say that again, there are ways to sort of, if you say, I'm interested in this particular area, okay, great. Is there some conference about that area? Is there some meetup about that area? Just go to it. Start meeting people. People will, if you make a good impression and you have something interesting to say, then yeah, the person you're talking to, if they're thinking about hiring you, they will go and look up your LinkedIn profile or something. But for many people, it's more important what you said and whether it was made sense and was interesting than, oh, this person has a degree from this or that place and so on. Depends on the company. But I would say that this is a thing where sort of, learning how to, figuring out where you want to make those connections and going and getting to know people in these areas is something that you can do. And it doesn't rely on, oh, I met those people in, in kindergarten or whatever. I mean, it's funny for me because I went to fancy schools in England, and I know a whole bunch of people who went into things like British politics and so on. I haven't lived in England for a really long time. I know those people; they're friends of mine. It's fun, but doesn't those connections don't make any difference to me. It's kind of as a person who kind of I've kind of over the years I've accumulated a really, I would say, well, a wonderful network of people I know. And honestly, that's accumulated by I go to different places. I run into people I find interesting. I'd like, keep in touch with them. Other people I don't keep in touch with, whatever. But, accumulating sort of a big, long list of people that you keep in touch with is, it's well, for me, at least, it's very, I like it. And it's also can be very useful. It's like something comes up and it's like, I really need to know about this thing. Wait a minute, do I know anybody who knows about that? Yeah, there's this person who I interacted with at this time and this time. Another thing to remember is that it's a sort of a strange thing. I'll run into people that, I recently went to what was it? An almost 50-year reunion of my elementary school class, okay? And the thing that's just so bizarre is you'll meet people and it's like, I haven't seen this person in nearly 50 years. And yet you'll start talking to them and you'll kind of pick up where you left off. It's often the case that, there'll be a person who you knew a long time ago, and it doesn't mean you can't, you can't remake that connection, so to speak. Having said that, there also are situations where people, particularly people who've been quite successful in some area or another, they get very fed up with people who are like, oh, I'm going to connect to this person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they tend to build some sort of membrane around themselves that can have slightly different effects. Let's see. Oh boy, so many interesting questions here. What do you do, from Crucial here, what do you do if you don't find something you're interested in for a long time? Well, that's not a problem I've personally had, because I'm interested in a huge number of things. I've often described when I do a big project and then I haven't yet started my next big project, I have this sort of stage of life that I haven't really had so much recently, but I used to describe it as an inter-project gap, where I was like, I haven't yet locked into another big project I'm doing. I think this question of what happens when, if you can't find that great project that you want to do or that great thing you want to do, one of the traps is, I've got to do a great thing. I've got to do a big thing. This is a particular trap for people who had some success early in their careers. They'll say, I've discovered this. I built this company. I built this. I can't do something smaller than that now. I've always got to do something bigger. That's a terrible trap, because then, you'll end up, but it's not going to be, this thing. I'm looking around. I look around for a decade. I can't find anything that's big enough that really justifies me jumping into it. That's a mistake. Instead, just do something you think is kind of fun. Say, well, I'm just going to do it for a few months just because it's kind of fun and whatever. Turns out that you may discover that the skills you learned from building that big thing before sort of, start filling out this thing that you thought, oh, that's just a little thing, I'm just going to do it for fun. It may turn out to be your next great piece of career. I think that, just do some random thing for fun is a good way to start. Don't say, oh, I'm going to think very, very carefully. I've got to be very strategic. I'm going to, make my next step in a very strategic way. Now, it's also the flip side of that is if you're doing a bunch of stuff, I always believe in spending some percentage, I don't know what it is, a few percent of my time kind of planning what I should do, as well as just doing stuff. Because you end up otherwise in a situation where it's just like, I'm doing stuff. I'm just going to keep doing stuff. I'm very, very busy. I'm very busy. Oh, 5 years went by. I'm very busy. Wait a minute. Am I really doing what I want to be doing? I think busyness is often a big enemy of actually doing what you want to do. And, I think for myself, one of the things that I have been very happy with in terms of the sort of trajectory of my life is that I have actually managed to do new things. I mean, I've done some fairly big things that have very long tails, that have, that need continued work for a long, long, long time. But nevertheless, I think it's sort of a mentality of thinking about things that, yes, there's some new thing, I'm going to go chase that new thing. Now, again, you can go to an extreme and you can be in every new shiny object that shows up, go chase it, and you never get anything finished. I think for me, the thing that I'm happy about and things I've managed to do is I finish things, but I managed to do new things. I suppose those are a little bit related, although when I say finish, sometimes they go through many stages, and something like Wolfram language, we're at 34 years and counting, and it isn't finished, but it's clearly gotten to points where it is useful. It is finished enough to be very useful. Let's see. Questions here. Okay, so there's a question from Nomo here, saying, you value culture and flexibility. Why do you need to grow your team? Is it not possible to outsource via open source and so on a large amount of work to the people? I think, here's what I've observed. When you want people to just sort of volunteer and do stuff, one of the things you have to do is define very precisely what you want them to do. You want them to edit Wikipedia pages. You want them to add maps to OpenStreetMap. You want them to add things to our demonstrations project. These are very well collimated activities. You kind of know what you're signing up for. You either like it or you don't. And you can, indeed, people can say, this is really fun. I'm going to do this. I'm going to make, Wolfram language demonstrations and put them on the demonstrations project site. Or I'm going to, add things to OpenStreetMap or something. I think that things which are very much there's thousands of examples of it already, tens of thousands of examples of it already. You're going to add more. Those are kinds of things where there may be people who will volunteer to do those things. Now, those things have to be sort of fun. If those things involve, oh, you've also got to work out all these grimy details of, getting the UX right and all this kind of thing, that's not usually a thing that volunteers sign up to do. I think that we've done a lot of experiments with kind of things like volunteer data curators, things like this. Some of those are fun. People do them, figure out who the main characters in certain fiction books are, go figure out, something in sort of in the country in which you live, how does this work, that kind of thing. Yes. Things that involve more kind of production work, people are, it's like this is a job basically, and it's not something people will tend to do in that kind of way. I think that the thing that I've noticed is if you want something innovative and new, and you really want to have a kind of a you want to invent something new that's never been invented before. That's not something that, defining a sort of world of kind of open contributors tends to be the best for. That's something where, in my observation, you need some leadership. There has to be a person, people who are like, yes, that they're going to get a lot of expertise in this area and then keep building on it. That's where you're really going to get strong, innovative leadership, rather than, oh, let's let 10,000 flowers bloom and hopefully one of them will produce something interesting. I mean, I think that's in the world of sort of scientific innovation, that's another place where one can debate sort of what the right ways to have things happen are. I mean, that's complicated because it gets very institutionalized with various kinds of funding and so on. But I would say that my observation is the question of you need people who, you either need to define very narrowly what you want and let people sort of self-select, oh yes, this is the thing I want to do. Or you really, if you want something where you don't know exactly what you want and where it's just like, you've got to innovate, I don't think it works very well to sort of throw that to the crowd. Let's see. There's a question here from Grisha. What business principles are of greatest utility yet are never addressed in university programs or courses? I may not be the right person to ask because I've never done any kind of business school class of any kind, so I don't really know quite what's addressed there. I do have the feeling, though, that so at least my view of sort of doing things, running companies, figuring out, innovating, and so on, a lot of it is about thinking, about solving things in ways that they've never been solved before. I think quite often what's taught in kind of business school-ish type settings is these are things that have been done before. This is, this is how you fit in. This is how you kind of, this is the standard pattern for how this works. If you're trying to innovate, the standard pattern is almost by definition not what's going to work. I mean, occasionally people have had, there used to be an old Soviet scheme, what was it called, trick or something, something like that, that was a sort of a scheme for innovation. It was kind of a programmed way of innovating. I was very suspicious of it always. I think that in a sense, the thing that is hard to teach in some ways is the just keep thinking, so to speak, and actually sort of engage the thinking apparatus in everything you're doing. I mean, I think one of the things that's always terrible to see is somebody has learned, they've learned all this stuff about analytical techniques for this, that, and the other, and then something comes up and it's like, well, this is something you could solve by analytical techniques, but they just don't think of that. It's like, I learned that in school, but I didn't really figure out how I was going to apply that in something that I was actually doing. I think that different people do things like run companies in very different ways. Some people are very people-oriented. I'm not sure how much the theory of how to the management of teams, for example, there are different ways to manage teams. There are ways that I suspect are more kind of cookie cutter and more kind of teachable procedures. There are kind of frameworks like agile development and things like this that provide kind of frameworks for managing projects and so on. And then there's sort of what happens when things don't fit into those frameworks. What happens when the people you have don't perform well when given those kinds of frameworks? How do you deal with those types of situations? What happens when the project you're working on just doesn't have such well-defined directions that you can fit it into a framework like that? I think that those are things where, one of the things to realize again is that, for example, if you're starting a company, the company is sort of molded to you in some sense. There are things you might do well. The company is you want to arrange the company so it is playing to your strengths, not arrange it so that, yes, that's what the business school book said, but actually I'm no good at that, and I can't really, I can't be effective in a company of that kind. So I don't know. Yeah, so as I say, I'm probably not the right person to ask that question of, because I just don't know the other side of that story. Let's see. There's a question from Kralos. Do you think the current trend of high-value tech IPOs is reminiscent of the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s? It's it is funny. I mean, when I got into the tech industry, being a tech entrepreneur was nothing. That wasn't a cool. It wasn't like being a rock star type thing. Over the years that I've been in this industry, it's kind of been like, for a little while, the tech entrepreneurs are the top of the heap, so to speak. Everybody wants to be one. Although I think that luster may be slightly, by the time there's classes that say, here's how you become a tech startup CEO, you kind of know that the crest of the wave is over, so to speak. But in terms of the world of IPOs and so on, I mean, there haven't been that many. The IPO market is just starting to heat up again. I think the mechanism of sort of how do you start, finance, et cetera, a company, there are many different epochs of how that's been done. I mean, I've been very fortunate in my current company that we just don't have outside investors, and that's allowed me to lead a much, in many ways, a much better life, I think, for myself, for the things I want to do, because I can do all kinds of crazy projects, and there's nobody really to answer to but ourselves, so to speak. And I think on the other hand, I could have done some vastly more ambitious projects, I suppose. I think we've done plenty ambitious projects. I'm not sure that our projects have been that limited, at least in the ones we've done, by sort of the amount of money available to do them. But there are certainly plenty of situations in companies where people are, you need to raise money to do the thing. I'm always, people can raise too much money. There's plenty of situations where people raise too much money, and it often makes them fail, because they kind of get too comfy and they say, well, we got to build this really big thing, and it's got to work this way and this way, and the market they have just doesn't support that, or just, I mean, it's a complicated dynamic, and for often the people who are putting the money in, sometimes they're motivated to have more money go in, either because they want to have a bigger share or because they want to make that investment look cooler or something else. And in a sense, I would say that the whole world of sort of what the strategy is for what happens to companies when they grow up, and when sort of when they're no longer in the kind of in the boost phase, so to speak, that's changed over the years. I mean, the whole notion of companies get bought, okay, that's been happening forever. Companies go public, that's been happening forever, although the scale at which it makes sense to go public, at least in the US markets, has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. Then there's, companies, then there's sort of the whole private equity story, which is kind of a whole different twist that's become more prevalent in the tech industry in recent years. I mean, that's it's a complicated thing depending on sort of one's objectives. I mean, again, it depends. Some people, it's like they'll do a company, they want to do it for a few years, they want to build it up to a particular point, then they want to sell it, go and do the next one, and and repeat that. It's it's a different kind of life than it's a different sort of roller coaster, so to speak, than the operate one company for a long time. In terms of sort of the tech IPOs, and are they overvalued, and is it reasonable that there are multi-trillion-dollar tech companies now? It's a fascinating moment. Tech is getting to be bigger and more powerful than governments and lots of other things. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I don't think we know yet. It's always the case that, the thing I suppose I've observed is that, new things are always happening, but history is always a guide. That is, there will be a new twist, and which we haven't seen it like this before, but yet we've seen there's a history that's worth knowing. I mean, the idea that everything is new, forget the history, it's all new, it'll be different this time, nothing will be like the historical situation, that's unlikely to be the case. But, oh, it's just a repeat of this or that historical situation. Well, no, the world has changed, things are different. Typically, you know, I don't know whether it's because there's enough knowledge of history or just because the world is different enough, it never precisely repeats. So, which is to say that it's hard for me to call what exactly is going to happen in the whole sort of tech becomes as the biggest thing in the world kind of thing. I don't know how that's going to play out. It's a super interesting question. Don't know the answer. I think, let's see. It's a question here from Feistel. If you were going to try and sell new software today, would you sell it as a product or a service? Look, the way that things have evolved, it used to be the case when I started out in the software, well, actually, when I started out in the software business, it was on, you know, big computers that were in specially cooled rooms and so on. So by the time it was at personal computers, one of the dominant forms of software selling was through corner software stores. You put the floppy disks in a cardboard box and you ship it out to people, and it's on a shelf in a store somewhere, and somebody's saying, I'm like in an old-fashioned bookstore, you know, I'm taking that down off the shelf, I'm going to buy that thing. So in that distribution channel, what they did was they bought the box, and then they had the box. And if you said to them, oh, by the way, the thing you just bought is going to expire in a year, they'd be like really annoyed. Now, what's happened, particularly as we've gone to completely online distribution, as the back end of a lot of software ends up requiring various kinds of cloud services and so on, it is not realistic to say, buy it once and, you know, and never sort of, never renew it. And so essentially all software has gone to this kind of subscription type model, partly because that allows one to, well, it's a good base of revenue for a company, but it's also something which allows one to justify having, yes, there's a cloud server and it keeps running and it keeps supporting what you're doing, even if the main thing that's happening is just right on your particular computer. But in terms of you know, product versus service, look, there's different, it depends on distribution channels. If you are selling something, I mean, okay, how does it work? If the thing is like $5 a month, there's no salesperson selling that. It's a thing you're clicking somewhere on the web, and you'll typically have some whole way of bringing people in. Maybe it's a free service. This is an upgrade, something like that. That's, you know, no humans are directly involved. And you know, that's one level. Another level is I can make this thing, I'll sell it for $1,000 or something. Or I'll sell it for, you know, $500 a year, or I'll sell it for some amount of money, but it's really pretty self-service. It's like you can, you know, the user gets it, they're off and running. It's all good. They don't have to, you know, they don't have to say, you know, they don't have to get somebody to configure it. They don't have to do all those kinds of things. Then there's sort of more enterprise level software. It's hooking into some elaborate existing database system. It's got all kinds of elaborate authentication mechanisms, all these kinds of things. You know, somebody's got to configure this software. And then you're sort of forced into something where there's going to be a services component, because it isn't something where you just sell it off the shelf and expect people to use it. Now, you know, sometimes it's, and again, it's also a question of, you know, how big is the market? Are there 100 places that could buy this? Well, you kind of have to make a lot of money from each of those places to justify the development effort. If there are 1 million places that might buy it, it's a different story. But I would say that you know, if you have a services-based company, you will spend a lot of money selling what you have to sell. I mean, typically what will happen is the cost of sales will be a substantial fraction of the revenue that you bring in. If you have something where it's just click on a website, well, the cost of sales may be practically nothing. The cost of sales might be, if you counted in there, something like you know, what you pay for web ads or something like this, or it might be literally nothing. People are coming to this website and they're just clicking to upgrade or whatever. So I think that the you know, if you say, well, I'm going to make something that's a very services-oriented thing, you're signing up for humans are going to be involved. You're signing up for a serious sales organization. You're signing up for managing a serious sales organization. It's a different thing from I've got this product. It's really a self-service thing. Anybody can get it. Perhaps there's an easy way into it through some kind of free thing that's a sort of a taste of what's going on. Then you don't really need that. But it's also a question of to what extent are you capable of building the actual sort of finished goods product where you can just hand it over to the user and say, be happy, it'll work for you. And to what extent have you only sort of got it to the point where it's always going to require special configuration and explanation, and somebody's got to explain it. So I think those are sort of the constraints. It depends on what you're selling and to whom. And in the modern world, kind of the distribution channels for software are very different than they once were. And it's sort of a question of into what distribution channels can you hook? And can you present your product in the right way by just having people see something on a website and be able to make a purchase decision based on that? Do you have to have sort of expensive human contact? Do you have some intermediate model of that? How does that work? That's what I would think of in that case. Let's see. Question here. I should probably not go on too much longer here. Okay, there's a question here from Prutz. What education do you need to receive to be able to research markets and design products if you're more from a technical side of things? Just learn to think. I mean, that's my observation. I mean, a formal framework for, I would say, just use analytical skills. Just, you're researching a market. Okay, how do you think about that? Well, it's like, who are the people who, what you got to think through what's going to happen. Like, imagine a product. Who might want to buy this? How would you communicate with those people? How would you, through what process would you convince them to buy something? How much money are they going to spend on it? Are they, how much support are they going to need in using it? Those kinds of things. These are things that, at least to me, seem like they're common sense questions. I don't think there's a sort of here's a place where you can go. I mean, I suppose that the incubators from Y Combinator on provide a certain sort of channel for doing that kind of education, the kind of think like a startup CEO, so to speak. So I suppose that's an answer to sort of an education plan for those kinds of things. Although I think increasingly those kinds of places are, you already got to have a company sort of up and running, and then you kind of you go through there after your company is kind of partly up and running. I think they're sort of they're often their model is they'll take some equity cut in your company, and if your company isn't anything, that's going to be a lose for them. So they really want the thing to be up and running in order that it makes sense for them to sort of invest in educating you, hoping for a return when your company becomes successful later. I mean, it's a form of investment, so to speak. I think so. I would say the real thing to do is to kind of it's like just apply your analytical skills to understand what to do. When it comes, I will say actually, let me make a pitch for one thing. We have a thing we call a Eureka program, which is a program for people who are building products that or thinking of building products with our technology stack. And that's something I've done a few events for it, but I'm not an expert on it. So I think you have to find it some other way. Maybe somebody can paste something into the text chat here about it. But that's a mechanism that we have for kind of trying to educate people. And that's really the story of that Eureka program is it's really case studies, different people from different parts of our company. And I think also some people who work with us outside the company, talking about the particular kinds of things they do. What is involved in software quality assurance? What is involved in corporate analysis? What's involved in some of these other functions? And how do you think about doing those kinds of things when you're starting a company and so on? So that might be a convenient thing to look at. There's a question here from Mikhail. Is it difficult to fire people? You know, there are many situations that happen. I mean, people, I would say that many times I've said to myself, we waited too long to fire that person. It didn't make sense to wait this long. Vast majority of the time, both sides know it isn't working. Vast majority of the time, it's, you know, things have gone very badly wrong. If somebody's like, I'm doing a fantastic job, and they're genuinely saying that, and how could you be firing me? I've been doing this fantastic job. They should have known for a while that things were not working out. And, you know, it's the thing to understand also is it's so often the case that there will be, well, okay, so many things can happen. It's like you hired the person, you made a mistake. It just wasn't the right person it wasn't the person you thought it was. Well, you know, then if there isn't a job that you can sort of pivot that person into, then it's just not going to work. And, you know, that's something you can explain. And particularly if it hasn't been that long, it's not such a difficult thing to explain. I think another case is people change. That's more difficult because I think the role, particularly if you have a company of a decent scale, I think the number one thing to try to do is the person changed. So the job they were doing doesn't make sense anymore. Find another job for them, or alternatively, say to them, look, you've changed. This doesn't seem to be what you should be doing anymore. Why don't you think about something else? Let me make a suggestion. You know, maybe you should think about, I don't know, becoming a professor, or maybe you should think about going into this, or maybe you should be doing that. And that's something that is like outside of the company, but the person, you know, I've seen cases where just by telling somebody, look, there's this other thing you should think about doing, and they say, yes, that's really a good idea, but they're not quite there yet. They're going to go and do some, you know, class or something, and they perk up so much by having this new objective that they actually perform quite well in the particular job that they're doing for you, until they say, okay, right, I'm ready to go off and chase this new thing. But I think that it's kind of a by the time you know, it's there are cases I'm remembering. You know, the interesting case is when people say to you years later, "Thank you for firing me. Like, I wasn't in the right job. This was the wrong thing. I needed to do something different, but I didn't kind of have enough initiative to decide to do that. This was what was needed to go to a different place." I mean, I think that it's a you know, there's other complicated things that happen. There's like the person has all kinds of sort of outside issues, but they're not things, you know, they're things that make it hard for them to do the job. But it's kind of like you feel, well, we should be supporting this person and so on. And you have to understand that ultimately, you know, companies have to operate as production type environments, and that's not ultimately going to work. And so you end up sometimes with these conversations of, given what's going on, you've got to change your job here, or if it isn't going to fit here, you got to go and find a job somewhere else. You know, another thing that can happen is you have a person and you say, this is really a good person. Unfortunately, you know, there is no job that we have right now for this person. And, you know, what are we going to do? Well, I've been lucky enough that our company has been of a scale where we have been able to say, these are people with absolutely unique skills. There's basically nobody else in the world who has these skills, but we don't have an incredibly intense need for these skills right now, but I think we will have at some point in the future. And, you know, you basically, you keep the people around. And that has been a spectacular success for me a bunch of times. Of people where they were doing things, they were useful, but they weren't, kind of absolutely spectacular. And then a project comes along for which they are the perfect fit. And then, great things happen, and it goes from there. But, I think the thing to realize is there's a lot of different niches in the world, and your company may not be the right niche for somebody. And it's almost always mutual. I mean, unless the situation is that the person is kind of like, well, I can get away with being in this job and I'm kind of taking advantage of this company. Well, if you're managing the company or whatever, that's not great. It's like, look, I'm sorry, you can't go on taking advantage of us, go find another place. And I think that's, but I would say that's not the, that's not the dominant situation. It's usually just things diverge in one way or another. Let's see. Oh gosh. Really better get going here, but there's so many interesting questions. Okay, there's a question from Lauliette here. With the increasing power of monopolies, will small tech startups still be able to make headway, so to speak? I think the answer to that is yes, and probably even more so, because the bigger things get, with certain exceptions, the more it's a very challenging thing to have a very big company and have it be very innovative and have it chase after all those little things. There are plenty of companies where if that's not going to be $1 billion business, we can't do it. So, and there are lots of things where in their early stages, it's absolutely not going to be $1 billion business, or nobody knows it can be $1 billion business. And that's a place where it has to be a little startup that does it, because the big company is just going to say, no, not for us, not provably big enough. And, if you look at a lot of industries, like, I don't know, the pharmaceutical industry, for example, that has been, it's absolutely the model there is the innovative stuff gets done in small companies. In order to really take a product to market in that space, typically you have to be a very big company. And so what ends up happening is there's this kind of supply chain of companies that get sort of consumed by bigger companies that then take their products all the way to market, so to speak, if they can. And I think that in terms of are there going to be niches? Now, one could say, well, any niche, any small company that gets big enough will get squashed by a big company. And perhaps that's true, but you have to get pretty big before it gets interesting for a big company to squash you. I mean, if you're a $10 million a year business, only the most peevish of product managers is going to say, who's running some $1 billion portfolio is going to say, let's just go after that, just for the sake of getting at that company. Nobody's going to do that. That's not sort of responsible business behavior. It's only when it gets big enough to be dangerous, so to speak, that kind of sort of competition is going to exist. Now there's another question of whether kind of the structure of distribution channels and so on is going to be such that people are kind of locked out of, and companies are locked out of being able to reach their customers. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that's a different dynamic that probably isn't going to happen. I mean, I think that if for example, every piece of software had to be sold through some very particular channel that was going to peel off every good piece of software, like it could happen with app stores and has happened with app stores to some extent. But again, it's a question of scale. You can be pretty big and still be too small for the sort of the big company competitor to want to be interested in kind of trying to siphon off your market. So I think the answer is, innovation is pretty hard for a big company. It's much easier for a big company to just say, let's go gobble up a little company that's already been innovative, then let's try to make our big company to turn this giant aircraft carrier in this direction that's more innovative. That's usually a really difficult thing to do. And the challenge, you know, in a company of my scale, for example, the you know, it's been very interesting to be able to keep on doing innovative things. And we've been able to make a company where we've kind of built in the idea of innovation as a thing that continually happens. But it's always the case. Whenever I'm trying to do a new kind of thing, there's a whole elaborate sort of dance that has to be gone through. We've got existing groups, they do existing things, they're successful. It's like, can we, you know, are we going to invest the resources and build this other group over here that does things in a sort of more kind of entrepreneurial way? How does that work? There are lots of pressures that will kind of push you back to the direction of the main aircraft carrier, so to speak. And that is a challenge for management to kind of, you know, build out that little piece. And sometimes big companies will have an innovation group whose sole purpose is to try to work with sort of innovative future concepts. And then their biggest challenge usually is to sell those innovative future concepts within their own company. To be able to take, you know, it's one thing to do sort of a proof of concept project about something or another. It's quite another thing to say, let's get the mainstream production part of the company to really adopt this and make use of that innovation. It's quite challenging. So I don't think, you know, startups are going away anytime soon. I think, if anything, but I mean, it has to be said that, you know, when startups become a giant production line themselves, and when people say, I'm going to do a class that's going to teach me how to make a startup, I'm going to make a startup, then I'm going to do my startup and I'm going to follow, you know, I'm going to get an A in startup doing. That means there are too many startups. That means it's become, you know, it's because the fact is innovation is by definition something which is going to be new and different. It's not going to be just, oh, it works the same way as it's worked in this case, in that case, in the other case, which is not to say that it isn't super worthwhile to know things about what's happened before, but it isn't something where you're likely to be able to have a pure sort of cookie cutter production line. I mean, and that is, in a sense, it's like the idea of a franchise business where, you know, you define, this is how you start a fast food restaurant of this type. This is how you start a tutoring service of this type. And, you know, just buy the kit and we're telling you how to do it, and you're an operator of that thing. You know, insofar as making an innovative startup is sort of like becoming a franchise, I don't think that's going to work. I mean, I think that's sort of almost by definition a doomed idea. Oh boy, there's so many more questions here, right? There's a question here: is publicity magic, or does it just happen, or is it well thought out in some way? You know, I have a saying about that, which is, you know, at times we've done things where we think the world should know about them. And, you know, it's like, oh, people should write about this, people should talk about this, and so on. I would say there are stories that are meant to happen and there are ones that aren't. There are things that are sort of meant to be very visible and there are ones that aren't. And my observation is, if you don't have one that's meant to be, you can push very hard and spend lots of money and you're not going to move that rock very far. You know, now you can take one idea and you can present it in a way that's so boring that nobody will care. Or you can take that same idea and be able to find a way to explain it that people are going to say, oh, that's kind of cool. You know, I'll talk about that. It's a sound bite. I've got a way to understand what's going on. And it's a sort of packaging of the idea where everybody says, wow, that's cool. And it's the same thing that you could equally well have presented in a very humdrum way and nobody would have cared. And I think that I don't know, you know, when we were working on early machine learning technology, we'd built an image identification system. And, you know, we could have just included that in the product and, you know, brought it out in a release and so on. But instead we had this website called imageidentify.com, it's very early image identifier. And, you know, we put that out as a thing. And it ended up getting, you know, people say, oh, this is cool. They've never seen something like this before. You know, you show it a picture of a rock or something and it says that's a rock. People had never seen that before. So it got to, you know, it was something which I knew was a kind of story that was meant to happen. And, you know, it got in all kinds of popular newspapers and things of people trying all kinds of different weird things and seeing what kind of mistakes it made. It was also important in that case that we presented it as, you know, this is a thing that sort of come out of R&D and it's kind of, it does cool things, but it also makes interesting, weird, welcome to the world of AI type mistakes. And that was something that could be very successful. I would say that yeah. So I think that it's really a question of, can you tell a story that people are going to care about? And then if it's a story people are going to care about, they're going to care about it. If it's a story that's going to be like, push this rock very, very, very hard, send out 1,000 pictures to different places, it's not going to go anywhere. Typically, I mean, and also sometimes it's like, we've had this experience actually with it's like, we'll put it out to, all the fancy places, and somebody will write a story in some very fancy venue, very fancy newspaper or whatever else. And I'll kind of know it's going to be a boring story. And, it comes out and it's like, nobody ever mentions the thing to me. It's like, yeah, it was in a really, if I was a PR firm, I would say, great hit, we got something in the such and such newspaper, fantastic. But, well, it's a boring story and nobody's reading it. Whereas there are other cases where it's like, well, that's going to be an interesting story. And, it'll be in different venues, and eventually it may build up to some of the sort of top venues, or may even go in there. If the journalists are doing a good job, if it's a good story, it will be in the top venues. And that's, so that's how I tend to feel about publicity kinds of things. I mean, there are things that people do that are pure publicity stunts, and sometimes when they're done with a light enough touch, that's a fun thing to do and a good thing to do. When they're done with sort of when it's kind of when you kind of I don't really know what happens when you have a sort of a pure publicity stunt where there's nothing underneath it, where it's just done for stunt value, so to speak. I suppose sometimes that can have a very short-term objective, like, oh, I just want to get this particular investor to sign up this week. If I do this publicity stunt, that's going to help with that. I don't know to what extent that has lasting value, as in, people see, I suppose, yeah, I mean, people hear about something and sometimes they'll go on remembering, but sometimes also it's, 15 minutes of fame and then, it's not heard from again. So, okay, I think I could, oh, there's a question here at the very end from Ethan. Are there any planned Wolfram Venture startups that people can join and work for equity? Yeah, there are always things we're thinking about, although I have to say, our company, if anything, is doer heavy rather than leader heavy. So it's if we were just brimming with people who like, this company is too small for me, is that there isn't enough room for me in this company, I've got to start my own new company, then we would have more of these kind of things where it's like there's a new company being spawned. There is actually at least one happening right now, but I think the concept, the thing to realize is, and it's very frustrating for me because there are many things that we should spin off as companies, and we basically lack leadership to spin them off. So if people think they can be good leaders, then we're interested. I think that that's the challenge, is companies are sort of created by their CEOs, and to spawn a company without a CEO is a tough thing to do. To have a company where it's like, here's the shell of a company, now just add CEO, that's a challenging thing. When a company is just getting started, often when a company is sort of grown up, well, certainly the investors in a company will often say, oh, that founder CEO is always doing crazy things. Let's wheel in a professional manager who can take the company to the next level. It's not usually a super good sign when that happens, I have to say. I mean, I think it is happening less and less in these years, perhaps. I mean, it used to be sort of the model was the crazy entrepreneur founder will get the company from 0 to 100 employees, and then the professionals will take over. I think that's often a risk mitigation kind of strategy, because the crazy founder who's gotten the company to a certain stage might just bet on something even crazier and wipe the whole thing out. But on the other hand, they might grow the thing dramatically, but the person who's the more sort of seasoned, I'm just an operating manager, is not going to do that crazy thing that might grow it, but they also won't do that crazy thing that will kind of ram the thing into the ground. But I would say that we are much more on the we're very interested in people who can take our technology and even things that we've built internally within our company and take them and make them into companies. But we're not so much in the we've got something internal and we've got an existing group of people and they want to split off. I mean, another problem that we have is, which I'm kind of happy to say, is I think people like working for our company. So when we say, gosh, we'd like to take your group and split it off, they're like, no, we like working for this company. We don't want to be split off and kind of, sold off somewhere. So that's, so we're more in the, we've got technology. Now we need kind of the CEOs, so to speak, to go and take that technology as something that can be independent. Anyway, okay, well, it's a lot of very interesting questions, which I haven't had a chance to get to here. And oh, there's a question here. All right, this one's an easy one from Mikhail. Do you use version control in the company? Of course, we have an elaborate source control, version control, release engineering system. It's a big effort. Actually, an interesting thing about our company is that, in a sense, we use something like that for projects as well as for actual software. So one of the things that's important in the company is we'll do a project, and sometimes we'll take the project to a certain point, and it's clear this project is not finishable in a cost-effective way at this time, or doesn't have a market that's appropriate at this time, and we will hibernate the project. And some projects have been hibernated for a decade, and then we can bring it back to life. And we are sort of good enough at maintaining sort of information about these projects that it really is possible to take the thing and sort of rehydrate it and bring it back to life even many years later. And that's a very important management dynamic, because it means that people are working on a project and they're like, oh, I'm worried this project's just going to get killed. In many companies, there are projects that get done and they just get killed and the project's never heard from again. That's extremely rare in our company, extremely, almost unheard of. And instead what can happen is the project is hibernated, most often for more like 6 months or a year, but people who worked on it know the work we put into this, it's there, it's meaningful, it's valuable, it's going to be built on top of, it's not just thrown away. And so that's something that, when we come back to re-energize that project again, it's something that we can work with again. And the dynamic of knowing that that's possible is very important. I mean, we operate a pretty traditional, we're always having, we'll have the main branch of our main product, and we'll have prototype builds, and we'll have branches and all the usual stuff. And I usually, on my computer, I get an overnight build every day, and I usually have a stable build and a prototype build. When I'm looking at new things, it'll be like people say, oh, you have to use the prototype build for that. And, sometimes the prototype build will crash on startup. That better not be the case, but it can happen. Usually the prototype build is a somewhat stable branch. And then there's a stable branch, and then the head branch that will be eventually become the next version of the product when it comes out. But yeah, I mean, if you're asking, do I personally use version control? The answer, I have to admit, is not typically. I typically refuse to interact with our version control systems, just because I tend to be too busy and too kind of whatever. When I get, usually my systems get copies of things like product documentation, and yes, I have a very terrible kind of dictatorial kind of mechanism, because when I make changes and push the changes back, they overwrite everybody else's changes. So it's like I have to be careful, but that's just become the most efficient mechanism that we have. So the company absolutely uses version control. I personally am not as well disciplined in development as that, because it tends to be the case that if I have a choice between spending a small shard of time making progress on some particular thing versus dealing with kind of the structure of working with our version control system, I tend to spend the shard of time trying to make forward progress. All right, well, I should wrap up here. Actually, I'm about to do another live stream that is a product design live stream about much more technical topics. But that's it for our business and innovation Q&A. This is interesting. It's only the second one of these I've done. It's been, I hope people have found it useful. It's interesting for me. My theory of the world is explaining things is a great way to understand what you're talking about. And this has helped me actually, and a number of things I've said here help me understand a little bit better the way I think about things, which is great as far as I'm concerned. What we're doing, just to for people who are interested, I'm signed up for several different Q&A kinds of things. I'm doing a more content-oriented science and technology Q&A for kids and others. That's on Fridays. Then an alternating weeks, I'm going to be doing this business and innovation Q&A and a history of science and technology Q&A. So look forward to joining you all at these in future. And I'm about to go off and do a completely different meeting that's more my day job. But if you want to check out what the day job involves, tune in to our language completeness and consistency product design session that's coming right up.